in 1988 in northern Iraq. Entire Kurdish villages were exposed to chemical gas dropped from their own government's aircraft. Survivors described the smell of apples in the air moments before people began collapsing in the streets. Children dying beside their parents, entire families suffocating without understanding what was happening. In the town of Halabja alone, around 5,000 civilians were killed in just hours. This was not a battlefield accident. This was a decision approved by Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein's rise to power was not sudden. It was calculated, patient, and methodical. Long before he officially became president of Iraq in 1979, he had already built a reputation as the man who understood how power really worked behind the scenes. While others focused on speeches, Saddam focused on control. While others built popularity, he built loyalty networks inside the military and intelligence services. The moment he officially took power revealed exactly how he intended to rule. Shortly after becoming president, Saddam called a high-level Ba'ath Party meeting. During what appeared to be a routine political gathering, names of supposed traitors were read aloud. As the list continued, armed guards entered the room. Some officials were immediately removed. Others were forced to publicly denounce their colleagues. Many of those taken away were later executed. The message was unmistakable and carefully staged. Everyone in the room understood that survival now depended on absolute loyalty. Throughout the 1980s, Saddam transformed Iraq into one of the most tightly controlled states in the region. His security apparatus operated through overlapping intelligence agencies designed not only to monitor the population, but to monitor each other, ensuring that no single group could organize against him. Informants became part of everyday life. Political prisons expanded. Fear became institutional. His regime also demonstrated how authoritarian leaders often combine nationalism with repression. During the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, Saddam positioned himself as the defender of Iraq against foreign threats. The war cost hundreds of thousands of lives and placed enormous strain on the country. But it also allowed him to justify expanding internal security measures in the name of national survival. The ANFAL campaign against Kurdish populations later in the decade became one of the most infamous examples of state violence in the region. Military operations targeted not only armed groups, but also civilian populations suspected of sympathizing with them. Villages were destroyed. Populations were displaced. Chemical weapons were used in multiple locations, leaving a legacy that still defines Saddam's international reputation. Despite the fear he created, Saddam carefully cultivated an image of strength. Portraits of him appeared across cities. State media portrayed him as both a military leader and a father figure. This combination of propaganda and repression created a system where opposition became almost unthinkable for many citizens. Yet, like many rulers who depend heavily on fear, his power proved strong but not permanent. After the Gulf War, in 1991 weakened Iraq, and years of sanctions strained the country. His regime survived longer than many expected, but its foundations were slowly eroding. In 2003, a U.S.-led invasion would finally bring his rule to an end. But the decades he spent in power left a permanent mark on Iraq and on the global understanding of modern dictatorship. Saddam Hussein remains one of the clearest examples of how fear, carefully organized and consistently enforced, can sustain power for decades. In February 1982, Syrian government forces surrounded the city of Hama after an uprising linked to the Muslim Brotherhood challenged state authority. What followed was not simply a military response. It was a calculated demonstration of what happened to anyone who seriously threatened the Assad regime. For weeks, artillery and armored units systematically destroyed opposition strongholds, while security forces carried out mass arrests throughout the city. By the time the operation ended, Hama had become a symbol across the Middle East of what absolute political control looked like when it was truly challenged. Hafez al-Assad did not come to power through popular election or sudden revolution. His rise was built through decades inside Syria's military and political structure. As an Air Force officer who later became defense minister, he positioned himself carefully during years of coups and instability that defined Syrian politics in the 1960s. In 1970, he carried out what became known as the Corrective Movement, a bloodless, internal coup that allowed him to take full control of the government. Unlike some dictators who ruled through visible chaos, Assad ruled through controlled stability. His strategy focused on building a security state where multiple intelligence agencies monitored political life. The military remained loyal to the presidency, and potential opposition was neutralized before it could become dangerous. His government relied heavily on the Mukhabarat, Syria's powerful intelligence network, which developed a reputation for surveillance, interrogations, and the ability to reach into nearly every part of Syrian society. Political dissent was rarely allowed to grow openly. Activists, Islamists, leftists, and even internal party critics could all find themselves under investigation if they appeared politically risky. Assad also understood the importance of building loyalty within key parts of the military. Many senior security positions were filled by individuals he trusted personally, often from communities that he believed would remain loyal to the regime's survival. This ensured that any serious challenge to his authority would face not just political resistance, but military force. The confrontation with the Muslim Brotherhood during the late 1970s and early 1980s became the defining internal conflict of his rule. After a series of attacks against government officials and institutions, Assad responded with overwhelming force. The destruction of Hama became the ultimate example of his doctrine that rebellion must be crushed so decisively that no similar uprising would be attempted again for a generation. And for decades, that calculation appeared to work. After Hama, large-scale internal opposition largely disappeared from public view. Syria entered a long period of authoritarian stability. The price of that stability, however, was political silence. Independent media did not exist in any meaningful form. Opposition movements operated only underground or in exile. Public political life became carefully managed. Assad also established something that would shape Syria long after his death, a political dynasty. As he aged, preparation began for succession within his own family. After his death in 2000, power would pass to his son, Bashar al-Assad, transforming what had begun as a military presidency into something closer to hereditary rule. Hafez al-Assad died, having maintained power for 30 years, one of the longest continuous rules in the region's modern history. His legacy remains complex. Supporters credit him with maintaining national stability in a turbulent region. Critics point to the heavy cost of repression that made that stability possible. His rule demonstrated a lesson many authoritarian leaders have understood. Sometimes fear is not used constantly. Sometimes it is used once, with overwhelming force, so that it does not need to be used again for a very long time. In 1979, millions of Iranians flooded the streets, demanding the end of the Shah's rule, believing they were fighting for freedom, dignity, and an end to authoritarian control. Many imagined a future with more political participation and less repression. But within just a few years, many of those same revolutionaries would find themselves imprisoned, exiled, or executed under a new system that proved just as unforgiving toward opposition. At the center of this transformation was Ayatollah Khomeini. Unlike many dictators who rise through the military, Khomeini rose through ideology. A religious scholar and outspoken critic of the Shah, he spent years in exile, building a following through recorded sermons and writings that were secretly distributed inside Iran. His message combined religious authority with political resistance, portraying the monarchy as corrupt, Western-controlled, and morally illegitimate. When the Shah finally fled Iran in 1979, Khomeini returned to massive public support. To many, he represented justice after decades of repression. But once the monarchy collapsed, a new question quickly emerged. What kind of system would replace it? The answer became the Islamic Republic, a political system combining republican structures with ultimate authority resting in religious leadership. At the top was the position of supreme leader, a role Khomeini himself would occupy, giving him final authority over the military, judiciary, media, and key political decisions. Very quickly, the new government began consolidating control. Revolutionary courts were established to try officials of the former regime. Many trials were brief. Some ended in execution within days. While supporters saw this as revolutionary justice, critics saw it as the beginning of a new cycle of political purges. Opposition groups that had also fought against the Shah soon discovered they were no longer allies. Leftist organizations, secular activists, monarchists, and even some Islamic factions found themselves increasingly marginalized or targeted. Newspapers were shut down. Political organizations were banned. Demonstrations were suppressed. One of the most defining features of Khomeini's system was the creation of parallel power structures designed to protect the revolution. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC became not just a military force, but a political and economic power center tasked with defending the ideological foundations of the state. Alongside it, revolutionary committees enforced social and political conformity. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in 1980 after Saddam Hussein's invasion, further strengthened internal control. Wartime conditions allowed the government to justify tighter political restrictions in the name of national survival. The conflict lasted 8 years and caused massive casualties, but it also reinforced the revolutionary leadership's authority. Perhaps the most controversial episode of Khomeini's later rule came in 1988, near the end of the war, when thousands of political prisoners were reportedly executed following secretive review processes targeting those still considered loyal to opposition movements. The events remain one of the most debated and sensitive chapters of the Islamic Republic's early history. Khomeini ruled Iran until his death in 1989. By then, he had transformed the country not only politically, but socially and institutionally, creating a system where religious authority became inseparable from state power. His legacy remains deeply influential. The structure he built continues to define Iranian politics decades after his death, demonstrating how ideological revolutions can produce systems just as durable as military regimes. His story illustrates another pattern among the most feared leaders. Some rule through the army, some rule through fear, and some rule by convincing millions that obedience is not just political, but sacred. In 2011, what began as small protests in the Syrian city of Deraa quickly escalated after several teenagers were arrested and reportedly tortured for writing anti-government graffiti on a school wall. When families demanded their release, security forces responded with arrests and live ammunition. Within weeks, demonstrations spread across the country. What began as calls for reform would soon spiral into one of the most devastating civil wars of the 21st century. At the center of this crisis was Bashar al-Assad, a man who had not originally been expected to become Syria's ruler. Unlike his father Hafiz, Bashar was not raised as a political heir. Trained as an ophthalmologist, he spent years studying medicine in Damascus and later in London. His older brother Basil had been groomed to succeed their father, but after Basil died in a car accident in 1994, Bashar was suddenly pulled into political life. Over the next several years, he was rapidly prepared for leadership inside Syria's military and ruling structures. When Hafiz died, Bashar became president at just 34 years old after the constitution was quickly amended to lower the minimum age requirement. At first, some Syrians and international observers believed his Western education and quiet personality might lead to reforms. There was even a brief period known as the Damascus Spring, when political discussion forums appeared and hopes for gradual liberalization emerged. Those hopes did not last. Political discussion groups were soon closed. Activists were arrested. The security structure built by his father remained intact, and Bashar increasingly relied on it as the foundation of his authority. While his image initially appeared softer than his father's, the underlying system of control never fundamentally changed. When protests began during the Arab Spring in 2011, the government initially portrayed them as foreign conspiracies rather than domestic grievances. As demonstrations grew, the state responded with escalating force. Arrests turned into shootings. Security crackdowns expanded into military operations. Defections from the army led to the formation of armed opposition groups, and Syria gradually descended into full-scale civil war. Over the following years, the conflict became extraordinarily complex, involving government forces, rebel factions, extremist groups, and foreign powers. Cities such as Aleppo and Homs became battle zones. Civilian populations were trapped between multiple armed actors. The humanitarian cost became staggering, with hundreds of thousands killed and millions displaced internally or forced to flee the country. One of the most controversial aspects of the war involved allegations of chemical weapon use in several incidents that drew international condemnation. Investigations by international bodies attempted to document responsibility, while geopolitical divisions complicated global responses. Throughout the conflict, Assad maintained support from key allies, particularly Russia and Iran, whose military and financial assistance played a major role in allowing his government to survive moments when it appeared close to collapse. With this support, government forces gradually regained control over major urban centers. Despite more than a decade of war, Bashar al-Assad has remained in power, making his regime one of the most enduring examples of modern authoritarian survival during prolonged conflict. His story highlights a different pattern from some other dictators. Some leaders lose power when crisis arrives. Others survive because crisis allows them to justify holding power indefinitely. Bashar al-Assad's rule demonstrates how modern authoritarian governments can endure even under extreme pressure, especially when supported by strong security structures and powerful international allies. And perhaps, most importantly, his story shows how quickly a government can move from promising reform to fighting for survival at any cost. When you place these four leaders side by side, coming from different backgrounds, different ideologies, and different paths to power, a deeper pattern begins to emerge. Saddam Hussein ruled through nationalism and military strength. Hafez al-Assad built a security state designed around calculated repression. Khomeini created an ideological system where political obedience became religious duty. Bashar al-Assad maintained power through survival during prolonged war. On the surface, they appear very different, but the real similarity is not how they came to power. It is how they stayed there. One of the strongest patterns is the early elimination of uncertainty. Each of these leaders understood that the most dangerous period for any authoritarian ruler is the beginning, when opposition still believes change is possible. This is why many of the harshest crackdowns often happen early in a regime. Public purges, arrests, or decisive military responses send a message before resistance can organize itself. Fear, in these cases, becomes preventative rather than reactive. Another shared strategy was the creation of overlapping security structures. Instead of relying on a single military or intelligence organization, many authoritarian systems create multiple agencies that compete or monitor each other. This reduces the risk of coordinated coups while ensuring loyalty flows upward toward the leader. Saddam perfected this model. The Assad governments relied heavily on it. Iran institutionalized it through revolutionary structures parallel to the traditional state. Another critical pattern is control of narrative. These regimes rarely describe repression as repression. Instead, it is framed as stability, national protection, revolutionary defense, or moral necessity. Language becomes a political weapon. Once violence can be framed as protection, it becomes easier to justify. Equally important is how these leaders shaped loyalty. In many authoritarian systems, loyalty is not based purely on belief. It is often based on survival. Key elites may remain supportive not because they fully agree, but because their own security becomes tied to the survival of the regime. Over time, entire political classes can become locked into the system because collapse would threaten them personally as well. Another common feature is how these regimes manage uncertainty within the population. Absolute terror is not always necessary. Instead, unpredictability often becomes more effective. When punishment appears selective and sometimes arbitrary, people tend to become more cautious because they cannot easily calculate risk. This creates self-censorship, which is far more efficient than constant enforcement. Perhaps the most powerful pattern, however, is how these regimes attempt to make themselves feel permanent. Portraits, speeches, state media, ideological messaging. The goal is not simply admiration. The goal is inevitability. When a population begins to believe a ruler cannot realistically be removed, resistance often declines long before repression is even needed. But history also shows the limits of this approach. No matter how permanent these regimes attempt to appear, they all face the same structural weakness. Systems built heavily around individuals often struggle with succession, economic stress, or prolonged crisis. Some adapt, some collapse. Some survive, but fundamentally change. And this leads to perhaps the most important insight connecting all of these leaders. Fear is extremely effective at creating control, but it is far less effective at creating trust. And systems that cannot produce trust often spend their entire existence trying to compensate for that weakness through even more control. One question appears again and again when studying authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Why do some of these governments last for decades, sometimes even passing power from one generation to the next, while others in different parts of the world collapse much faster? The answer is rarely simple, but several structural advantages help explain this durability. One of the most important factors is control of the military before control of politics. In many stable democracies, the military answers to the state. In many long-lasting authoritarian systems, the state answers to whoever controls the military. Leaders like Saddam Hussein and Hafez al-Assad understood this early. They did not just command armies, they carefully reshaped them. Key positions were often filled with individuals tied by family, tribe, sect, or long personal loyalty. This reduced the risk that the armed forces would ever act as a neutral institution. Instead, they became part of the survival mechanism of the regime itself. Another major factor is the management of social divisions. Many of these regimes ruled over countries with deep ethnic, tribal, or religious diversity. Instead of eliminating these divisions, authoritarian leaders often learned to manage them strategically. Some groups were favored, others were marginalized. This created a balance where different factions sometimes feared each other almost as much as they feared the government. In such situations, the regime could present itself as the only force preventing total chaos. This strategy creates a dangerous psychological calculation inside society. Even citizens who dislike the government may hesitate to support change if they fear what might replace it. Stability, even harsh stability, can begin to feel safer than uncertainty. Economic structures also played a role. Countries with strong oil revenues or strategic geopolitical importance often developed what political scientists sometimes call rentier systems, where the state gains large income from resources rather than taxation. When governments depend less on taxes from citizens, they often face less pressure to be politically accountable to them. This financial independence can strengthen authoritarian durability. International politics is another key factor. During the Cold War and after, many regimes survived not only because of internal strength, but because of external alliances, strategic location, energy resources, and regional conflicts often meant that powerful countries supported stability over political change. This external backing sometimes gave regimes breathing room during moments of internal crisis. But perhaps the most underestimated factor is adaptation. The dictators who last the longest are rarely the most visibly brutal at all times. They are often the most flexible. Some allow limited reforms when pressure builds. Some restructure security forces. Some change economic policies. Some carefully control how much repression is visible at any given time. Survival depends not just in force, but on timing. This is why some regimes collapse suddenly while others endure for generations. It is not only about strength. It is about the ability to constantly adjust the balance between fear, control, concessions, and survival. Yet despite all these advantages, history keeps demonstrating the same underlying reality. No authoritarian system has ever truly made itself immune to time. Leadership ages, economies change, new generations emerge with different expectations. Information becomes harder to control. Pressure accumulates slowly, often invisibly, until a moment arrives when what once looked permanent suddenly looks fragile. And this brings us to the final and most important question. Not how these dictators ruled, but what their stories ultimately reveal about the limits of ruling through fear. History tends to remember dictators by the fear they created, the prisons, the purges, the wars, the systems of control that made millions of people feel small in the presence of the state. Saddam Hussein ruled through intimidation. Hafez and Bashar al-Assad built survival through force. Khomeini reshaped a nation through ideology. For years, sometimes decades, they appeared untouchable. But history also shows something equally important. None of them were as permanent as they seemed. Saddam ended his life in a courtroom, judged by the same population he once ruled through fear. Hafez al-Assad built a system strong enough to outlive him, yet one that forced his own son to spend his rule fighting to preserve it. Khomeini created a revolutionary state that still exists, but one that continues to face pressure from the very society it transformed. Power, built on fear, can control behavior, but it never fully controls what people believe. And that may be the most important lesson these leaders leave behind. Authoritarian power often looks strongest when opposition is silent, but silence is not always loyalty. Sometimes it is patience, sometimes it is survival. Sometimes it is simply time doing what it always does to systems built around individuals, because history shows something dictators rarely admit. Fear is powerful, but fear is temporary. Every system built on intimidation eventually faces a moment where control becomes harder, where pressure becomes heavier, and where the future becomes impossible to fully predict. Some regimes, some collapse, some slowly transform into something else, but none escape the same fundamental reality. No leader rules forever. And perhaps that is why the most feared dictators in history are not remembered only for how much power they had, but for how much they needed fear to keep it. Because in the end, the true measure of power is not how many people obey when they are afraid. It is how many would still follow if they were not.